The CEO of a thriving hotel empire decided it was time to experience the service of his own creation from a guest's perspective. Without any prior notice to anyone at the hotel, he would be checking into his flagship location, a decision made in complete secrecy to test how the hotel was being run by those he trusted to carry his brand forward. On the way to the hotel, he thought about all the years of work he had put into building the empire, the countless late nights meetings with investors, and the struggles to get to the top. He had always remained hands on, wanting to ensure everything was perfect. But this time it was different. He was going in incognito, no flashy suits, no entourage, just a normal man wanting to feel like any other guest. He thought about the employees who worked tirelessly every day to keep the place running smoothly and hoped that his visit would allow him to see any cracks in the system before it was too late. As he pulled up to the grand entrance, the valet quickly approached his car. With a smile, he greeted them, but didn't make any attempt to stand out, keeping his demeanor calm and simple. He handed over his keys to the valet, who was momentarily puzzled by the simplicity of the car and the man behind the wheel. Still, the valet went about his business, and the CEO walked into the hotel lobby with his suitcase in hand, unnoticed by those who passed by. As he entered the lobby, the soft lighting and elegant design of the space surrounded him. He smiled to himself, thinking of the vision he had for this place and how far it had come over the years. He approached the front desk where a young woman sat, typing away at her computer. Her name tag read Emily. She looked up briefly as he approached and smiled in a courteous but businesslike manner. "Good evening, how can I help you?" she asked with a professional tone. He returned the smile and replied, "I have a reservation under the name Thomas Harris." His voice was calm and smooth, giving no hint of his true identity. Emily quickly began typing the name into the system, scanning for any matching records. She furrowed her brow for a moment before looking back up at him, her smile faltering slightly as she confirmed his name wasn't showing up in the system. "I'm sorry, sir, it appears we don't have a reservation under that name. Are you sure you've booked with us?" she asked, trying to sound polite. But the confusion was evident in her voice. The CEO's calm expression remained unchanged. He nodded slowly and replied, "I'm certain I made the booking, just double-check the name, maybe there's a typo." He could see the receptionist's hesitation as she checked the system once again, but her fingers danced across the keyboard with increasing urgency. When nothing came up, she looked back at him. "I'm afraid there's no record of a reservation for a Thomas Harris. I'm going to need to see your ID to confirm your identity before I can check you in," she said, her voice growing more firm though still professional. He raised an eyebrow, but kept his voice even. "I don't have a reservation under my name, that's odd," he said, his voice dripping with just a hint of amusement. But he said nothing more. Instead, he stood there waiting for her to figure it out, watching the young receptionist struggle as she glanced nervously at her screen and back at him, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk. The CEO leaned casually against the counter, deciding to play the part of an average guest who didn't mind the minor inconvenience of the check-in process. He could see the receptionist's growing discomfort as she glanced up at him and then quickly looked away, shifting uncomfortably in her chair. He couldn't help but smile to himself. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. A man who had built an empire from the ground up being mistaken for someone who wasn't important enough to warrant special attention all of a sudden felt oddly freeing. She cleared her throat and asked once again, "Sir, I'm going to need you to show some ID or provide the booking number, please." Her voice now tinged with a slight edge. The CEO remained silent for a moment before finally reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. It was an old leather wallet, nothing flashy, just practical. Inside were a few cards and his driver's license. But as he pulled it out, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment things might go terribly wrong, or if it was a test he had set for himself and for those who worked under him. As the CEO slid his wallet across the desk to Emily, she hesitated for a moment before reaching for it, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of the wallet. She opened it slowly and began to inspect his driver's license, her eyes scanning the name printed on it. But there was no immediate recognition from her face, no flicker of realization that she was holding identification of the very man who owned the entire hotel chain. She glanced at the photo, then back at the license, before looking up at him, her confusion still evident. "I'm sorry, sir, but this name doesn't seem to match anything in our system," she said, her tone now much colder than before. It was as if the realization that something was off had finally set in, but she didn't want to admit it. She continued to stare at the license, as if waiting for some clue to appear on it. But nothing did. The CEO leaned in just a bit closer, maintaining eye contact, and casually said, "It's possible the reservation wasn't updated properly in your system. I assure you I am who I say I am." His voice was calm, his expression neutral, but beneath it all there was a subtle confidence that suggested he wasn't just an average man seeking a room. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat, not sure how to proceed. She had been trained to handle all sorts of situations, but this felt different. It wasn't just that this man was insisting on something, but rather the air about him that exuded authority, power, and calm. He didn't look like the typical guest, one who might argue for a free room or try to bypass the usual check-in rules. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was very wrong about this encounter. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried again to find some record of the man in the hotel's booking system, but each search turned up empty. The CEO's calm presence remained as he watched her flounder, her eyes dilating back and forth between the screen and his face. He could tell she wasn't getting it, but he remained silent, content to watch the scene unfold. The tension grew thicker and thicker in the air as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I'm really sorry, but without a reservation under your name, I can't check you in. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or perhaps wait in the lobby while we try to resolve this," she said, trying to sound polite. But there was an edge to her words now that suggested she was growing impatient. The CEO blinked slowly and took a step back from the desk, his lips curling into a slight smirk. As he surveyed her reaction, he could sense her growing discomfort. But he was also struck by how professional she was trying to remain despite the mounting pressure. He decided it was time to reveal a bit more of the truth, but not all of it. He spoke again, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not asking you to check me in, I'm telling you to check me in." His words hung in the air for a moment. As Emily's eyes widened, she glanced at the ID once again, as if searching for some hidden clue that might explain what he meant. "I've worked hard to build this place from the ground up," he continued, his voice becoming a bit more personal. "But if you're unable to find my reservation, then I'll just make a decision for myself," he added, his tone carrying a touch of finality, as though his patience was running thin. Emily took a deep breath and nervously glanced around the lobby, as if looking for some sort of help. She looked at the other employees who were standing nearby, but no one was rushing to intervene. She was on her own in this moment, and all of a sudden the weight of the situation felt much heavier than before. She looked back at the CEO, now clearly unsure of what to do. But there was still a part of her that refused to believe he was who he said he was, and in that moment, she made the decision to keep pushing forward even though everything inside her was screaming to back down. She gave him one last attempt at a stern look. "Sir, I'm afraid that, without a reservation or proof of your identity matching our records, you're not allowed to stay here." Her voice was cold and unwavering, but even she knew deep down that something was wrong. The CEO watched her carefully as she stood her ground, her words cold and firm, but there was a tremor in her voice. He could see it in the way her hands twitched ever so slightly, the nervousness creeping into her demeanor. He had seen it many times before in people who were unsure of themselves, in moments when they were faced with a situation they didn't know how to handle. He could feel the tension rising like a wave crashing over them both. But he remained calm, unfazed by her challenge. He took a step back, letting his presence speak for itself. His silence stretched on, and Emily felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She could feel his eyes on her like a spotlight, making her feel as if the entire lobby was watching them. As the seconds ticked by, she began to feel more and more exposed. She had tried to stay professional, tried to follow the rules, but now she wasn't so sure she was doing the right thing. She glanced nervously at the other hotel staff who were beginning to take notice of the unfolding exchange, but none of them moved to assist her. They stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Was this some sort of test, some kind of elaborate prank, she wondered, or was this just another frustrated guest who had been refused service? She could sense the growing pressure as the CEO's calm expression never wavered. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't gotten angry, but there was an undeniable aura of authority around him that made it clear he wasn't just any guest, and he wasn't going to be treated like one. Emily took a deep breath and forced a polite smile onto her face. Sir, if you'd like, I can ask my manager to come and speak with you. Perhaps they can help resolve this situation, she suggested, trying to buy some time, but deep down she knew this wasn't the kind of situation that could be easily fixed. The CEO's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered her offer, but before he could respond, a soft voice interrupted from behind him. Is there a problem here? Emily turned quickly to see the hotel manager standing just a few feet away. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him, his face instantly recognizing the gravity of the situation. The manager's eyes flicked between Emily and the CEO, his expression unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. The manager walked over to the front desk and stood next to Emily, his gaze now fixed on the CEO, who stood there unmoving, a subtle yet confident smile playing at the corners of his lips. The manager cleared his throat and extended his hand toward the CEO. Good evening, sir. I'm David, the hotel manager. I understand there's been some confusion with the check-in process, he said, his voice polite but tinged with the anxiety of someone who could feel the weight of the moment. He waited for the CEO to respond, but the CEO merely nodded and motioned toward Emily, who still held his driver's license. I was simply trying to check in, the CEO said calmly. But apparently there's no record of my reservation, and my identity seems to be in question, he said with a slight chuckle, as if the whole situation were an amusing inconvenience. David's eyes widened at the mention of identity, and he quickly glanced down at the driver's license Emily had handed him. When he saw the name and photo, his face drained of color. He quickly looked back at the CEO and then at Emily, as if trying to piece together what was happening. Emily's face turned bright red as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had just been questioning the very person who owned the hotel. She had just treated him like any other guest who didn't follow the rules. David cleared his throat again, this time with a nervous laugh. Sir, I can't tell you how sorry I am for this misunderstanding, he said, his voice shaky but trying to remain professional. Emily stood there frozen as the magnitude of the situation finally sank in. The CEO smiled faintly as he straightened up and prepared to speak again, his voice calm and composed, but carrying an edge of authority that made both the receptionist and the manager stand at attention. I understand mistakes happen, he said slowly, but this is a hotel where service should be impeccable. Every guest deserves to feel like they belong. He paused and glanced at Emily, who was still visibly shaken. This experience isn't one I'm likely to forget, he added, letting the weight of his words settle over them. The CEO stood there silently, letting his words linger in the air as Emily and David exchanged uncomfortable glances, both of them clearly feeling the gravity of the moment, neither knowing how to respond to the very man who owned everything they worked for. The silence stretched on as the CEO's calm presence seemed to fill the entire lobby. He could see the way their discomfort grew with each passing second. He had no intention of being cruel, but he wanted them to feel the weight of their mistake. He wasn't here to reprimand them, but this was a moment for reflection, one that they would not easily forget. He took a step back from the front desk slowly and turned his gaze toward the rest of the lobby. The employees, who had been watching from a distance, still hadn't moved. They all stood frozen, as if unsure whether they should intervene or simply stay out of it. The CEO could feel their eyes on him, as if they were waiting for him to make the next move. He didn't know whether they were curious about what would happen next or worried that the situation might escalate, but he decided it didn't matter at that moment. It was clear that no one had ever seen him like this before. No one had ever seen him in this context, without the usual fanfare of his title or the recognition that usually came with it. Here, he was just another man checking into a hotel, but one who was being treated with suspicion as if he didn't belong. He glanced back at David and Emily, who were still standing awkwardly at the front desk, both of them uncertain of what to do next. The manager cleared his throat again and took a step forward toward the CEO, as if trying to regain control of the situation. Sir, please accept my sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding, he said, his voice strained but trying to sound sincere. I understand that this situation has been frustrating, and I assure you we will take immediate steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. He continued, his hands were clasped together in front of him, his posture stiff and formal. The CEO looked at him for a moment before responding. His voice was still calm, but now there was a slight edge to it. It's not about the apology, he said, his words deliberate and measured. It's about the experience. Every guest should feel valued here, not just treated like another number or another transaction. He paused and let his words sink in. This hotel is built on a foundation of service. If that's missing, then nothing else matters. His eyes flicked back to Emily, who was standing behind the desk, her face flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't expected this to happen. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate like it had. But here she was at the center of it all, knowing she had made a mistake that would cost her more than just a reprimand. The CEO turned back to David, who seemed to be processing everything with a mix of guilt and confusion. The manager nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of what the CEO was saying. You're absolutely right, sir, he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just had a wake-up call. This is a service business, and we should always strive to make every guest feel welcomed and valued. He glanced at Emily and then back at the CEO. We will ensure that this doesn't happen again, and will take steps to improve our training and communication moving forward. The CEO smiled faintly at the manager's response. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He nodded once more. I'm glad to hear that, he said. Then, without another word, he turned to leave the front desk, but not before glancing one last time at Emily, whose eyes were downcast. She had yet to say a word since the situation had unfolded. She hadn't apologized or acknowledged the mistake she had made, and the CEO couldn't help but feel a little disappointed by her silence. But he didn't dwell on it. As he walked toward the elevator, he could hear the soft murmurs of the other employees who had been watching from the sidelines, but they quickly fell silent as he passed them by, his footsteps echoing in the quiet lobby. It was clear that the situation had left a mark on everyone involved, but only time could tell whether the lesson would be learned or simply forgotten. The CEO stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. The doors closed slowly behind him, and for a moment, he stood there alone in the quiet space, the weight of the interaction with Emily and David still heavy on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the way the hotel was being run over the years. The passion and the personal touch that had once been the foundation of his empire now seemed to be missing. The whole point of what he had built was to create a place where every guest felt like they were treated with dignity, no matter who they were, no matter their background or their status. But standing at that front desk today, he had been treated like just another faceless customer, and that reality was unsettling. He exhaled slowly and leaned back against the elevator wall as it ascended higher into the building. He knew the hotel was still successful and the business was thriving, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about maintaining the integrity of the brand and ensuring that it was more than just a place to stay for people. It was about creating experiences that made guests feel special, that made them want to return time and time again. He thought back to when the idea for the hotel first came to him. It hadn't been about luxury or grandeur, but about providing a sense of belonging for everyone who walked through the doors. His original vision had been about bringing people together, creating a community of sorts. But somewhere along the way, that vision had been blurred by the pressures of expansion and the demands of running a massive business. He wondered how many times this kind of experience had happened in the past without anyone noticing. How many times had guests been treated like a transaction rather than a valued part of the hotel's success? He sighed as the elevator finally reached the top floor. The doors opened and he stepped out into the expansive penthouse suite. that he had designed with his own hands. The city lights stretched out before him like a vast ocean of possibilities, and he felt a sense of calm wash over him as he took in the view. It was a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had accomplished, but it was also a reminder of the responsibility he carried to make sure his vision never lost sight of the people who made it possible, the employees, the guests, the people who walked through the doors every day to create a memorable experience. He walked over to the large windows and gazed out at the city for a moment before turning his attention to the phone on the desk beside him. He picked it up and dialed the number for his executive assistant, who answered on the second ring. "Good evening, sir. How can I assist you?" she asked with her usual professional tone. The CEO paused for a moment before responding, his voice calm but resolute. "I want to schedule a full review of the hotel's customer service policies and procedures," he said, his words precise. "I want to know exactly how our employees are being trained, how we're communicating with our guests, and what steps we're taking to make sure everyone feels valued, not just the people who can afford to spend the most money." He continued, his voice growing more focused as he spoke. "We need to go back to basics. We need to remember that it's not just about luxury, it's about making people feel at home, making them feel welcome." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before his assistant responded. "Understood, sir. I'll get to work on it immediately," she said, her tone respectful and acknowledging the seriousness of the request. The CEO nodded even though she couldn't see him and hung up the phone. He sat down at the desk and took a deep breath as he reflected on what had just happened. He wasn't angry at Emily or David, he knew they were just doing their jobs. But the fact that the situation had unfolded the way it had made him realize that something had shifted in the culture of his company over time. It wasn't just a problem with one employee or one isolated incident, it was a larger issue that needed to be addressed. He couldn't afford to let it slide. He needed to take action now before it got worse, before the very thing he had worked so hard to build became just another business without heart, without soul. He closed his eyes for a moment and imagined the future of the hotel, his hotel, one where every guest, no matter their background, was treated with respect and kindness, a place where the personal touch he had originally envisioned was present in every interaction. No matter how big or small, he knew it would take time, but it was a step in the right direction, and that was all that mattered. He opened his eyes and stood up with a renewed sense of purpose. It was time to make a change, the kind of change that would restore the hotel to its roots and remind everyone that it was about more than just luxury or status. It was about people and how they were treated. The CEO spent the next few hours reflecting on his decisions and planning his next steps. He knew that one conversation or one email wasn't going to change everything. It was going to take time to rebuild the culture he had once nurtured, to get back to the core values that had made his hotel chain so successful in the first place. He couldn't ignore the fact that something important had been lost over time, something that had made his business different from the competition. It was about human connection, about treating guests like family, about understanding their needs before they had to ask. But somewhere in the hustle of growth and expansion, the focus had shifted away from people, and that needed to be addressed. First thing the next morning, he made a note to contact his senior leadership team and schedule a meeting to discuss his vision for the future of the company. They had always been on the same page when it came to the overall goals of the business, but this new direction was different. It wasn't just about making money or keeping up with the latest trends. It was about going back to basics, about rediscovering the soul of the hotel chain that had made it so unique over the years. He knew it would be a tough conversation, but it was necessary. The next morning, he sat down in his office with the senior leadership team. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and concern. As they waited for him to speak, they knew something was off. But no one was prepared for the words that came next. The CEO began slowly laying out his thoughts. He spoke about the encounter with Emily and David, how it had made him realize that the essence of his company had been eroded over time. The focus had shifted too much toward efficiency and profitability, and not enough toward providing meaningful experiences for the guests. The faces around the table were silent as he spoke, each of them listening intently. But none of them spoke up immediately. They all knew that the shift in focus was necessary but they hadn't quite anticipated the urgency in the CEO's voice. When he finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and waited for their reactions. The first to speak was the head of operations, who cleared his throat and gave a hesitant nod. "I think you're right," he said slowly. "We've been so focused on growing and expanding that we may have overlooked some of the basics." He paused for a moment before continuing. "But how do we get back to that personal touch? How do we make sure our employees are on the same page?" The CEO smiled faintly at the question and replied, "It starts with leadership. It starts with us. We need to lead by example. We need to show our employees how to connect with guests, how to make them feel valued and heard." He looked around the table to make sure everyone was paying attention. "We need to invest in our staff, provide them with the tools and training they need to give the best experience possible to every single guest that walks through our doors." He paused and took a deep breath. "It's not just about luxury, it's about service. We can't afford to let our brand become something that's just about high-end amenities and status symbols. We need to go back to making people feel welcome no matter who they are or how much money they have." The head of marketing nodded thoughtfully. "That's a powerful message," she said. "It's a shift in how we market the brand as well. We'll need to make sure we're communicating that we're more than just a hotel, we're a place for everyone." The CEO nodded. "Exactly, we need to appeal to the heart of the people, not just their wallets." The conversation continued as they worked through the details of what would need to be done to implement these changes. They talked about retraining staff, revisiting the company's values, and developing a new guest experience model that prioritized personal connections over transactional interactions. It was a lot to take in, but the CEO could see that his leadership team was on board. They understood the importance of this shift, and they were ready to take action. As the meeting wrapped up, the CEO stood and thanked everyone for their time. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," he said, "but I'm confident we can do it if we stick together and remember why we started this in the first place." As the team filtered out of the room, he stayed behind for a moment, reflecting on the conversation he had just had. He knew it wouldn't be easy to turn things around, but it was a start, and that was all he needed to move forward. The journey to rediscover the heart and soul of the company had begun. It was a journey that would require patience, dedication, and a willingness to change, but it was one he was ready to take, and he knew his team would be there to support him every step of the way. The CEO spent the next few days immersed in meetings with various departments, reviewing training programs and refining the company's core values. He was determined to rebuild the culture he had originally envisioned for the hotel chain, one that placed guests at the center of every decision. He began visiting different hotel locations, speaking with staff, and getting a first-hand look at how things were being done. It wasn't an easy task, as many of the employees were still operating with the mindset that efficiency and luxury were the main goals, but as he spoke with them and listened to their concerns, he began to see a shift taking place. Some were hesitant at first, unsure of what the new direction meant, but as the CEO continued to emphasize the importance of personal connections and creating memorable experiences, they started to warm to the idea. Slowly but surely, the changes started to take root. He knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but each small step forward felt like progress. He spent time with the front desk staff, explaining how they could improve guest interactions and how every conversation mattered. He reminded them that they weren't just checking people in, they were making guests feel welcomed and valued. He showed them the importance of remembering names, remembering small details that could make a difference in someone's stay. Over the next few weeks, he continued to lead by example, visiting each hotel in the chain and holding team meetings where he talked about the importance of kindness, empathy, and human connection. The message was slowly sinking in, and employees started to take ownership of the changes that were happening. The CEO also worked closely with the marketing team to ensure that the brand message was being communicated clearly and effectively. They created new campaigns that focused on the human aspect of the hotel experience, showing how the hotel wasn't just a place to stay, but a place where guests could feel like part of a community. They used real stories from guests and employees to highlight the personal connections that made the hotel stand out from the competition. It wasn't about flashy advertisements or extravagant amenities, it was about people and their experiences. The feedback started to pour in from guests, and employees alike. Many praised the new approach and felt that the hotel had become a more welcoming and inclusive place. The CEO received letters of appreciation from guests who had noticed the difference in the service they received. They spoke about the genuine warmth they felt from staff members and how it had made their stay feel special. Others expressed how the hotel had become their go to destination because they knew they could count on the same level of care and attention each time they visited. For the CEO, this was the validation he needed. It was proof that the changes were working and that his decision to refocus the company on human connection had been the right one. But despite the positive feedback, there were still challenges to overcome. Not everyone was on board with the new direction. Some employees still clung to the old mindset that luxury was the most important aspect of the business, and some guests were skeptical about the new approach. They wanted the high end amenities and top tier service they had come to expect, and weren't sure if the shift in focus would affect that. But the CEO knew that he had to stick to his vision and continue pushing forward. It was a long road ahead, but he was committed to seeing it through. As the months passed, the culture of the hotel chain continued to evolve. Employees became more engaged and connected with the guests they served. They were more proactive in anticipating needs and offering personalized recommendations. The front desk staff took extra care to remember details from past stays, and guests began to feel like they were walking into a familiar home instead of just another hotel. The CEO knew that the work wasn't done yet, but as he stood in the lobby of one of his hotel locations, he saw the transformation happening before his eyes. The staff were interacting with guests like they had known them for years. Their faces lit up with genuine smiles, and the atmosphere felt warm and inviting. It was a far cry from the cold and impersonal environment he had walked into months earlier, and in that moment, he felt a sense of pride. He knew he had made the right decision. The hotel chain was on the path to something greater than just success. It was about creating a place where people could feel valued and appreciated, where guests could experience more than just a stay. They could experience a connection, a sense of belonging, and that was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. It wasn't just about luxury, it was about the impact they could make on people's lives, and he was determined to continue making that impact for years to come. Months passed and the transformation continued to take shape across all hotel locations. The CEO remained hands-on, making frequent visits to the various branches. He noticed that employees were taking more pride in their work. They were more enthusiastic about engaging with guests and offering personalized touches. Many of them began to take ownership of their roles, seeing their contributions as more than just tasks to complete, but as opportunities to make a difference in someone's experience. The change wasn't always smooth. There were still moments of resistance from some employees who struggled to let go of old habits, but the CEO remained patient and persistent. He reminded everyone that change took time and that the journey wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. He also continued to work closely with the senior leadership team to ensure that the new culture was being reinforced at every level of the company. They revisited training programs, making sure that employees at all levels understood the importance of empathy, communication, and service. They incorporated these values into performance reviews and daily operations, ensuring that everyone from the front desk staff to the housekeeping team was aligned with the company's new direction. The feedback from guests was overwhelmingly positive. More and more people were returning to the hotels, praising the personalized service and the warmth they felt from the staff. The CEO received countless emails from satisfied customers who shared how a simple conversation with a staff member had made their stay unforgettable. Some guests even mentioned specific employees by name, thanking them for going above and beyond to make their visit special. The CEO smiled when he read these messages, knowing that his efforts were paying off. He also felt a sense of pride in his employees who had embraced the change and were now creating the kind of experiences that he had always dreamed of providing. His leadership team began to notice the difference too. The brand was starting to stand out in the competitive hotel industry, not just for its luxury offerings, but for its genuine commitment to people. It wasn't just about offering five-star amenities, it was about offering five-star service and care, and the guests noticed the difference. This shift in focus began to attract new customers who were seeking more than just a place to stay. They were looking for a place where they could feel valued and appreciated. The CEO watched as the hotel brand began to gain recognition for its unique approach to hospitality. It wasn't long before other businesses in the industry took notice. They began to reach out to the CEO asking for advice on how they could implement similar changes within their own organizations. The CEO shared his experiences with them, offering insights on the importance of cultivating a strong company culture and focusing on the human aspect of business. He emphasized the importance of listening to employees and customers and making sure that their voices were heard. He encouraged other businesses to take the time to reflect on their values and make sure they were aligned with the kind of experiences they wanted to create for their customers. He was humbled by the requests and proud to see that his company's approach was inspiring others to rethink how they did business. It was proof that the shift in focus was not only changing the lives of guests, but also making a lasting impact on the entire hospitality industry. As the hotel brand continued to grow, the CEO remained steadfast in his commitment to the values that had defined it from the beginning. He knew that the journey was far from over. There would always be challenges to face, but he was confident that the company had a solid foundation built on the principles of respect, kindness, and human connection. The changes that had been implemented were not just temporary fixes, they were part of a long term vision for the future, a vision that was focused on creating a place where people could feel truly valued and at home. He looked out over the hotel lobby one evening as he walked through it on another visit. The atmosphere was completely different from what it had been when he first arrived. The once impersonal and cold environment had been replaced with a warmth and energy that could be felt in every corner of the space. Guests were interacting with staff like old friends, sharing stories and laughter. The employees were proud of the work they were doing. They were proud to represent a company that valued them and their contributions. The CEO's heart swelled with pride as he realized that the hotel was no longer just a place to stay, it had become a place to belong. And that was the greatest success of all. He knew there would always be room for improvement, but he was no longer concerned about luxury or status. He was focused on something deeper, something that would last much longer than any material possession. The connections, the relationships, the memories that were being created every day were what truly mattered, and that was the legacy he would leave behind. As the years passed, the CEO's vision for his hotel brand continued to evolve. The changes he had set in motion were now deeply embedded in the culture of the company, and the results were clear. Not only had the guest experience improved, but employee satisfaction had also skyrocketed. Staff members were more engaged and motivated than ever before. The work environment had transformed into one of mutual respect and collaboration. And it wasn't just the front desk staff or housekeepers who were embracing the new values, it was every department from management to marketing to operations. Everyone had bought into the idea that creating genuine connections with guests was at the core of the business. This shift was evident in everything they did. Employees went above and beyond to make guests feel welcome, from remembering small details about their preferences to offering personalized recommendations that went beyond the typical service expectations. The hotel wasn't just a place to stay anymore, it was a destination in itself. Guests were returning time and time again, not just for the luxury amenities, but for the sense of belonging they felt. When they walked through the door, they knew they would be treated like family, and that was what kept them coming back for more. The CEO couldn't have been prouder of the changes he had helped implement, but he knew that success wasn't just about achieving a goal and resting on his laurels. It was about continuously improving and adapting to the needs of both employees and guests. He kept in close contact with his leadership team, regularly checking in on their progress and encouraging open dialogue about how the company could continue to grow and improve. He wanted to make sure that the culture they had built remained strong and that future generations of employees would carry the torch forward with the same passion and commitment to service. It was a long term vision, one that extended far beyond his own tenure as CEO. He began thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave behind and the impact he hoped to have on the hospitality industry as a whole. He wanted to be remembered not for the luxury of the hotels or the money they had made, but for the way they had redefined the guest experience. and the way they had put people first. He wanted his company to be known as one that cared deeply about its employees, its guests, and the communities in which it operated. His leadership team was fully aligned with this vision, and together they began exploring new ways to give back to the community. They implemented programs that supported local businesses and charities and encouraged employees to volunteer their time to causes they were passionate about. The hotel chain became known for its commitment to social responsibility and sustainability, which further enhanced its reputation as a company that cared about more than just profits. The CEO knew that the true test of his vision would be in how the company continued to thrive. Once he stepped down as CEO, he had started planning for a seamless transition to new leadership. He wanted to make sure that the values and culture they had worked so hard to cultivate would be carried forward, and that the company's success would continue long after his departure. He handpicked a successor who shared his commitment to the company's core values, someone who understood the importance of building relationships and creating a sense of belonging for both guests and employees. The transition was smooth, and the new CEO took the reins with enthusiasm and a clear understanding of what needed to be done to continue the work that had been started. It wasn't always easy, there were challenges along the way, but the foundation was strong, and the company's commitment to its people remained at the heart of everything they did. Over time, the hotel chain grew even larger, expanding into new markets and becoming a global brand. But no matter how big the company became, the CEO's original vision of human connection remained the driving force behind its success. The legacy of the hotel chain became one of authenticity, warmth, and genuine care for people. It wasn't just about luxury or status, it was about the connections made, the memories created, and the lives touched along the way. And when the CEO looked back on everything he had accomplished, he felt a sense of fulfillment that couldn't be measured in numbers or accolades. It was about knowing that he had made a difference in the lives of so many people, both guests and employees alike. He had built something that was more than just a business, it was a place where people felt valued and at home, and that was the true measure of success. He had started with a simple vision, and through hard work, dedication, and a relentless commitment to doing the right thing, he had created a legacy that would last for generations to come. The story of the CEO and his hotel brand became an inspiration to others in the industry and beyond, showing that the key to true success wasn't in the products or services offered, but in the way people were treated and the connections that were made along the way. It was a reminder that in business, as in life, the most important thing was always the people.